Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right. I'm just going to have to ask it. Tim, why are you standing there stiff as a board? I don't think I've seen you move for more than an hour.
Hush. Keep your voice down. I'm trying to blend in.
Blend in? Blend in with what?
With these standing stones.
Huh?
I'm trying to find out the secrets of Stonehenge.
But we're not in England. We're in New England.
Oh, I know. I'm well aware of that, but there's a Stonehenge in the United States. And I thought if I looked like a stone, they might take me into their confidence as one of them and maybe pass along some of the mysteries to me.
Okay. That's probably the strangest thing I've ever heard, but you might be there for a little while. But in the meantime, I think that our guest this evening can fill us in a little better on some of the secrets, maybe a little better than you can.
Oh, okay. Well, let me move my arm up a little then. Okay, I'm headed back to the studio, but very stiffly. I don't want to give my concealment away. I think I'm very well camouflaged here. How much do I get? How much do I get paid for that?
You mean from the American Stonehenge people?
Yeah, but from anybody.
Well, I don't know. Maybe they pay. What would that be? It wouldn't be royalties. Maybe advertising fee or something like that.
Yeah, promotion.
Promotion. There you go. Little free promotion.
Well, I've been to Stonehenge in the UK. In fact, I had quite a bit of an adventure there a few years ago. I pulled out a book that we published, and you contributed to it, the UFO Prophecy, Visions of the Town Haunted by Flying Saucers. And Warminster is a little community. I think it had a population of about 9,000 or 10,000 when I was over there. That was UFO crazy for a period in the 60s and 70s, and very close as far as the crow flies to the ancient monument. Although I don't know if they necessarily have crows there, but as far as the UFOs go, they certainly do have. They certainly did have plenty of those at the time. So I'm interested in standing stones and standing monuments and why they seem to have such magical powers. So I think that's kind of the concept of the show this evening, Tim.
Yeah, that and who may have been responsible for building, say, like America's Stonehenge, and some of the other more mysterious structures found around the United States. It's the intro for the show that can be seen on the KCRR website. Talks about who may have been the first people to discover the Americas. I mean, of course, we know the indigenous people, were here, but who are some of the other contenders?
Well, we know the Knights Templar were up around Newfoundland when they went to Oak Island.
Yeah, right. Well, that's they're in the contention. The Romans, Polynesians, Chinese. Seems like everybody was here long before Columbus allegedly discovered the Bahamas. Or is it?
My theory on this. People talk about the flat Earth, and it's only been how many centuries since people came up with the concept that the Earth is round. I think that's a bunch of hooey. I believe that these early explorers and the governments that financed them would like to have had people think that the Earth was flat and that it would fall off so that they would keep their carcasses in their own backyard and not go hunting for a new world, which they wanted to rape, pillage, and plunder for whatever purpose. So I think that was one of the grand hoaxes of all time, is that the Earth was flat and you would fall off.
Oh, well, yeah. And in Columbus's day, it was well known that the world was round. I mean, they were even selling globes. You could buy a globe of the Earth in the market. So, I mean, that was just, I think, more of a modern thing, that Columbus's sailors, were afraid of falling off the edge of the Earth.
Well, I'm not afraid of falling off of anything except my recliner at night. Anyway, Tim, tell us who we're going to be conversing with this evening in our little chit chat here and exploring the bizarre.
Oh, sure. It'd be my pleasure. Well, we in our introduction, we mentioned America's Stonehenge, so that'll bring us to our first guest, Dennis Stone. Now, Dennis Stone is the president of America's Stonehenge, and we'll have to ask him whether which name came first, his last name or America's Stonehenge. Well, and I'm sure he's heard that one, a million times before. So now Dennis graduated from Daniel Webster College in 1977 with a degree in aviation management and was a full-time commercial pilot for over 35 years before his retirement in 2016. Now, America's Stonehenge was opened to the public in 1958 by Dennis's father, Robert Stone. Dennis has been involved with America's Stonehenge for most of his life and has always had a fascination with archaeology and archaeoastronomy. Since retiring, Dennis has found many serpentine walls and spirit windows throughout the site, among other new discoveries, and he has taken numerous courses and traveled extensively to ancient sites, both in the United States and internationally. His family includes his wife, Pat, his son, Kelsey, and his daughter-in-law, Catherine, and his hobbies include traveling, boating, and classic cars. Now, also with us tonight, making a return visit, always happy to have Jim with us, is Jim Willis. After graduating from Eastman School of Music, Jim became a high school band and orchestra teacher during the week and a symphony trombonist on the weekends, a jazz musician at night, and a choral conductor on Sunday mornings. Wow. The author of 9 books on religion and spirituality, he has been an ordained minister for over 40 years while working part-time as a carpenter and the host of his own drive time radio show, an arts council director and adjunct college professor in the fields of world religions and instrumental music. Now, I should mention that Jim is also the author of a number of books, including The Dragon Awakes, Rediscovering Earth Energy in the Age of Science, Ancient Gods, Lost Histories, Hidden Truths, and the Conspiracy of Silence, and Supernatural Gods, Spiritual Mysteries, Psychic Experiences, and Scientific Truth. So, Jim and Dennis, thank you very much for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre.
Welcome indeed, gentlemen. Happy to have you here. You know what I want to find out, and I think maybe we should have Jim come in for this. Jim, what is there about these standing stones? And we think of them mainly as being on the English countryside, but obviously now we know that there's one in New England. And I did visit the site of the U.S. Stonehenge many, many years ago. I can't even remember where it was, but I was a little rock at the time, so it's much different than today. What is it about these stones that give off this energy? And who discovered this? I believe it was done through dowsing.
Yeah, mystery number one. Dowsing came along later. I think that we have forgotten how to really connect with these stones the way our ancestors did. They had to have a powerful reason for doing it, for moving these megaton boulders. In some cases, we couldn't even do it today without some extensive equipment, big equipment. And there are places in the world, in Lebanon, for instance, where we couldn't even lift those stones with the equipment that we have. some brand new sites in Siberia. The same idea. It's just amazing. We don't know how they did it. We don't know why they did it. We don't know who did it. We don't know when they did it. All we know is that they did it, and the reason must have been a powerful, powerful reason. I have to believe it has something to do with a deep down sense of spirituality that we have allowed to atrophy here in these days, in these modern days of the industrial age that we live in. I think that it's still within us. I know with me, it didn't wake up until I started dowsing when I was 65 years old. So
No way.
yeah. Yeah. And of course, I live down here in South Carolina now, where we go back. Well, I live right near the Savannah River, and about 40 miles downriver from us is an archaeological site called the Topper Site, where they have found lithic debitage of people who have been chipping stone tools and things like that. Going back, it's been tested by a number of different organizations. It's been every archaeologist in this field has come and looked at it. It has been verified over and over and over again that this is dated in soil that goes back at least 35, maybe 40,000 years, which is a long time for history. When I lived up in New England, it was a lot easier because when you go back 10, 12,000 years in New England, you run smack into a mile-high glacier, and it gives you a little less of a time frame. But it's just amazing to me. I will never forget the first time I stood at America's Stonehenge. Back then it was called Mystery Hill. And I was talking to Dennis just before the program. I'm almost positive that it was his father, Robert, who took me around. He just happened to be there. It was a rainy afternoon, I remember, and the rain lifted. And I had mentioned my interest in a lot of these megalithic structures that we have out in western part of Massachusetts, monks' caves and stones and things like this. Of course, the archaeologists out there, they all call them root cellars.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
You crawl into one of those things. Here's this mound. They sometimes call them beehive huts. And there's to get in, you've got to go through an opening that's about 2 feet square, and you got to get down on your hands and knees. And I don't know of a single New England farmer that would even consider putting roots down there. You put a basket of potatoes down there, and they're going to rot on you within a very short time. And yet, if any of these structures, including, I think, America's Stonehenge, if any of these structures existed in England, if they existed in France, there'd be no question what they are. The only problem is that people just simply don't want to believe that there was pre-Columbian contact with Western Europe, and it's a shame because to me it's just exciting. I stood there at Mystery Hill and I just got chills up and down my spine. I wish I'd had a pair of dowsing rods with me, and I wish I had been doing more dowsing back in those days. I didn't start it until I came down here to South Carolina, but I wish I had. It would have been a wonderful thing, and someday, if I can get back here from South Carolina back up there, I'm going to bring my dowsing rods next time I visit Mystery Hill.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned about these root cellars, so-called root cellars throughout New England. I've had, I'm in contact, maybe you are too, with Paul Eno, of course, and he's done some investigative work, some of his associates as well. And we've had many reports that have come our way about strange apparitions inside and around some of these structures, as if they actually are part of some sort of vortex field, or a gateway to some other dimension, perhaps, and that's getting pretty wild now. I remember.
Well, I'm not sure it's very wild when you can start to consider the strides we've made in quantum mechanics, quantum theory now, because when you stop to think about it, I mean, everything is a manifestation of energy. Even our bodies are a manifestation of energy. Our bodies are just simply swirling masses of energy that have clumped together on this side of the Higgs field. And I think that the day is going to come, hopefully during even my lifetime, when we're going to be able to really look at all of these things and understand that there's some serious science behind energy vortexes and things like that. I find it fascinating.
Well, now, quite a few years ago, I was up near Lake Superior,
Mm-hmm.
and I had some time to kill on a Sunday afternoon. And a young woman came into the hotel where I was staying, and she was a park ranger. And I guess on Sunday afternoon they take the tourists out for a guided tour of some of the trails and so forth. But it happened to be raining that afternoon, and nobody seemed like they wanted to go out in the mud. So I just happened to ask her, had anybody seen anything unusual around there? And she said, well, you've got to talk to our main park ranger. I don't remember what his name is. It's probably written down because I've written about this probably in a couple of my books. But she took me to the local park ranger headquarters, and he described to me, I believe he even had a file on this, about the people, campers and all, who had gone back into the, should we say, underbrush. Some had gone with canoes to find lost streams and all, and they had stayed overnight in one of these. Well, now I can't remember the name, and I'm sure you'll come up with it. It's not a hut, but it's a thing that looks like a miniature stone structure with the overlapping top on it. And you could, I guess, camp under there or meditate under there or whatever. And apparently, the 2 nights that they were there, strange balls of light, or let's call them UFOs for lack of a better term, showed up and pounced overhead. And that, coming from a park ranger, I thought that was kind of peculiar at the time. But he said no, that there had been other people that had reported this type of phenomena. What would be your thinking on that? Have you seen anything unusual, or had reports from people who have had similar experiences?
Can I put in a plug right now?
Oh,
I
by
have
all
a book.
means.
I have a book coming out this fall.
Yeah.
It's being published by Finhorn Inner Traditions, and
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
it's called The Quantum Akashic Field: A Guide to Out of Body Experiences for the Astral Traveler. And the book is full of stories like this that I've taken, for instance, from my own OBE journal. You have to remember, you're talking to a guy. I'm almost 73 years old now, and until I was
You're 2 years older than I am. So no.
until I was 62, I didn't believe any of this stuff. I thought it was I was a left brain theologian professor, college professor at worst, at best. And once you start to get into this and take it seriously and open your mind and find the peace that you need, which is very difficult to do in this hectic civilization, this hectic culture we live in. But once you begin to come into to touch with these kinds of activities, and we came out here to the woods in South Carolina deliberately for that reason. We wanted to get in touch with the divine, with the holy. We didn't know what it was. We didn't know how to do it. I'd been a minister all my life. I've been preaching about it, but it was all this left brain preaching about rather than the experience of. And I'm absolutely convinced that the experience that we found in the last 10 years is the experience that our ancient ancestors lived in for many generations, thousands of years. I'm not even sure that we can. Well, let's put it this way: we can. There's been a lot of talk lately about Denisovans and Neanderthal and how we carry their DNA with us. I'm not sure that the kind of experience that was theirs, that they passed along to us in our very DNA, that could explain the kind of spirituality we're talking about. We are predominantly what they call modern humans, so to speak, a very left brain, science oriented, industrial type civilization. But down deep within, we can still find these coming these kind of feelings, these kind of actions, and this kind of energy. And I've had quite a few experiences like this myself, but I have no idea. I have no doubt that the people you talked to really did experience something that was real and that was important. And I think we need to know more about it. I've been in contact quite recently with Dean Radin out in California quite a bit.
Oh, yes.
And his new book on magic, Dean is about as left brain scientific as you're going to get. And his new book is just selling off the charts. It's being translated into different languages. I think people are open for it. Maybe that's going to be our salvation after all, a reawakening of this kind of earth magic, of this kind of earth energy.
Well, why would and I call them UFOs because that doesn't mean they're interplanetary, but it means that they're unexplained. Why would UFOs seem to attach themselves to such monuments or structures?
Boy, I wish I could answer that.
I wish you could too.
I can only look at it as such that there are places where energy swirls around and energy accomplishes some pretty fantastic things. I have no doubt that the universe is full of life, but I don't even think we need necessarily to hypothesize nuts and bolts spaceships to be visited by aliens, because the whole idea of the multiverse and many different dimensions, parallel dimensions that are being taken very seriously now by theoretical physicists. This is, I think, just a wonderful exploration. When you talk about energies, I'm fascinated, and I really want to hear Dennis talking about this energy line that connects the I think it's the equinox, the east-west, the equinox line, with not only Stonehenge, but also going all the way to Lebanon. Because if you follow that line, he followed it, of course, east toward England and then over across the Mediterranean. If you follow that line the other way, it comes down here dangerously near where I have discovered a ley line, an earth energy line that comes right through our property. And I'm dying to find out if we're on the same wavelength, so to speak, with America's Stonehenge up in New Hampshire.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No. I was waiting for
no. Well, I was just going to say that was an interesting point, because it always seems to me that possibly that whoever had built these structures originally had some kind of awareness, of these types of earth energies. That's why they built there.
I think so. A lot of these places, Göbekli Tepe, for instance, are built in places you just wouldn't go on and build a place like this if you were just doing it to be convenient. Some of them are hard to get to. There's no water. There's nothing around that would seem to say this is where it has to be, except the energy in the earth itself. I think our ancestors felt it, and that's why these megaliths are built where they are.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we are coming up to our first break of the evening. So when we come back, we'll bring Dennis Stone into the conversation and find out, we've been kind of dancing around this, just what America's Stonehenge actually is. So stay tuned. We will be right back in just a few minutes on Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. Tonight we're talking with Jim Willis, and now we're going to bring Dennis Stone into the conversation. Dennis, how you doing tonight?
Oh, fine, thank you. Thank you for having me on this evening.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We've been wanting to have you on for a while now, so I'm glad we could finally get the alignments, get the alignments of the planets and stars just right. All right. So, like I said before we went on our break, we've been kind of dancing around America's Stonehenge. So why don't you tell our audience who may not be familiar with it just what exactly America's Stonehenge is?
Well, it's a complex of stone structures. We're located about 40 miles north of Boston in southern New Hampshire. and about 20 miles from the Atlantic seaboard. It's a hill of about 110 acres, and on this 110 acres is stone structures. There are chambers, there's ramps, courtyards, a complete set of underground drains that keep the place dry, and it was all engineered before they actually built the chambers on top. But surrounding the main site, which is about 1 acre of most of the stone structures, astronomical alignments, and that covers about almost 20 acres of the 110 acres with the vertical standing stones we call monoliths. And these are aligned with the sun, moon, and stars. We think the site's not a living place. We think it was a ceremonial center for many different reasons, but the structures really are not designed for living purposes, but they do look ceremonial, if you will. And I've seen a lot of these same chambers throughout my visits to Europe, for instance. I think there's about 50,000 megalithic sites in Western Europe, and ours functions very similar to Stonehenge. However, the form is different. It's not the same shape. It looks more like some of the other chambers surrounding that, particularly in Ireland and Spain and Portugal. And megalithic sites are not only a Western European thing. They're actually all over the world. They cover Asia. They're into China, Southern Africa. Recently, we've become aware that they're in Australia and South America. So they seem to be on 6 out of 7 continents. And megalithic basically means just huge stone sites. But the style, the construction, the orientation of our site is very, very similar to the ones you'll see not only in Europe, but throughout Russia. And it's really amazing. We thought back in the 1950s, our site was very unique and that was it, with maybe about 12 other sites in the Northeast. But today, we know of about 800 sites from Canada right down to the mid-Atlantic states. So our site is not the only site. It might be one of the most complex for its area of 110 acres, but it's not the only site. So when my dad began, it's like, this is it with a couple other sites. But today we know that they actually have found recently the same type of chambers out in eastern Colorado, Alabama, and in Georgia. So we don't have the only chambers for sure, just up here.
So now your father bought the property in 1958, is that correct?
Yeah, he first visited the site in 1955, and it was a radio talk show, and he heard about it on a show out of Boston, and he lived 8 miles away, and on a Friday night, his show was called Yankee Yarns, and the talk show host was Alton Hall Blackington. It was on one of the biggest stations in New England, right out of Boston. And on this particular Friday night, they were talking about these stone ruins, and it really caught his attention. He had only lived 8 miles away and had never heard of this. So it really amazed him what they were talking about. He's like, how can that be? It's just down the street, 10-minute ride. In that same week, he was at a barbershop waiting to have his hair cut, and he saw a New Hampshire Profile magazine. It was 3 years old, and while he was waiting, he was reading it. And as he flipped through the pages, there's a site again. There's a whole article about it. It was kind of the feature of that particular monthly issue. So he asked the barber if he could keep that. And the barber said, well, how old is that? He goes, well, it's 3 years old. He says, yeah, sure, take it. They were at my aunt and uncle's house, a bunch of people, probably 10 people playing cards and having a good time that following Saturday. And he took it out and he showed it to everybody, and everybody passed it around. Nobody really recognized it until it got to my aunt and uncle. And they looked at it, studied it, and said, oh, wait a minute, we were there in the 1930s. We used to go down there and picnic, So it's kind of an informal picnic area to the local people. And my dad says, can you find it? And he goes, well, we haven't been there in 20 years, but we'll give it a shot. So the next morning they came down, they drove all over the place. They finally found what looked like the road and parked the car next to it, and then they walked up the hill about a half a mile, and they actually, were able to get into the site. They climbed into a barbed wire fence that's still there today. The fence was put up in 1938 by the first investigator, Mr. Goodwin. And after that, as I say, it was history. My dad just fell in love with the place, and he did open it up in 1958 as Mystery Hill Cave. So we just had our 60th anniversary this summer on the summer solstice, as a matter of fact.
So, okay, now you mentioned the 1930s. How long had people been aware that this was an unusual location?
Well, the History of Salem came out in 1907 by a gentleman named Edgar Gilbert. He was a friend of Robert Frost. They used to work together in the textile mills down in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And so Edgar Gilbert wrote the history. It came out in 1907, and it said about these particular chambers that they're. He said that it's a wild but wonderful place among the soft pine and rough boulders where weird tales may be woven. Very poetic. I don't know if Robert Frost helped him on that, but this guy was a poet too. And that was 1907. By 1937, Mr. Goodwin from Hartford, Connecticut, got involved with the site. And he was really the first researcher. And he wrote several books. One was called The Ruins of Great Ireland in New England, primarily about our site, but he knew of about those 12 sites that I mentioned before throughout New England. And then he was there until 1950 when he passed away. His idea was that it was a Viking site. And he also wrote a book called The Truth About Leif Erikson. And it wasn't too long after they began uncovering the site with all the brush and debris that had covered it over the years that he recognized it wasn't a Viking settlement. It wasn't sod houses. It was actually stone chambers with stone roofs. It looked different than what the Vikings would have built, and they weren't really livable type structures. So he changed his idea. It was the Irish Culty monks coming over 1,000 years ago, kind of for religious freedom, and part of it was to escape the Vikings too. And so he felt when he died that it was built just over 1,000 years ago, and it was a Viking settlement. I mean, an Irish Culty monk monastery, excuse me. And so that theory was there for quite a few years. So he was really the first investigator. So it was 80 years ago last year that the first archaeological research began. So we kind of had that anniversary, and our 60th anniversary being open to the public was last summer. So it's been under investigation. It's going to be pretty soon. It'll be a century. It's coming up pretty quick.
So now, conventional archaeologists state that there's nothing unusual about this site or any of the other ones that people have pointed out. What is their reasoning? Why would they look at this and say, nothing to see here, folks? What are they saying about it that that doesn't float their boat, so to speak?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, No Explorers Before Columbus was a kind of an acronym that was brought up by Samuel Eliot Morison, the great naval historian. Felt that there were no explorers before Columbus. He died in 1976, and the Viking settlement up in Lonzo Meadow, Canada, was identified in 1960. So he did say, well, maybe the Vikings, came. He kind of backtracked a little bit. He said the Vikings came, but they left really no impact, so it was not of any consequence. And anybody else coming over before that were not of any consequence either. So basically, Columbus gets all the credit. Mm-hmm. So these chambers, and today, like I mentioned, we know hundreds of them in the Northeast, and they actually stretch out across the landscape. Should not really be here because ancient man in the Northeast weren't supposed to be building stone ruins like what we have up on our site. So some of the mainstream think the sites, like you mentioned earlier in your talk about being root cellars, these don't really look like root cellars. And generally root cellars are in basements, not always, but inside of basements, clay floors, and they have ventilation. And they say 90% of the chambers in New England do not have ventilation, and they're usually built on bedrock. And I worked on a farm back in 1969, and they had a modern day kind of a root cellar for keeping the vegetables cold, made out of concrete. It was like a big bunker. And it doesn't look like our site at all. And there was a family that moved there bought a piece of the land in actually 1734, part of the hill. And 10 years later, they bought another piece of the property, which included part of the stone ruins. And so they're given credit for building the site. The name was the Patty family. And actually, there were 5 generations of shoemakers. They did some domestic farming on the side, but primarily they were shoemakers. And when you look at the site, I lived on a farm in Vermont for 3 years when I began my flying career up near Rutland in North Clarendon, Vermont. And I looked at all the farms up there, and I grew up in Derry, New Hampshire, only 8 miles away, right next to a farm, actually 3 farms right around our house. And I always said, this place does not look like a farm. And the Patties were shoemakers. It doesn't look like a shoe shop. I had a couple of grandparents that used to work in shoe shops. And some people say, well, the sacrificial table was a cider press. It really doesn't look like a cider mill, and there's no archaeological evidence supporting that whatsoever. The nearest apple orchard was over half a mile down the hill, but archaeologically, there's nothing on the property that was found that would indicate that the Patty family had a cider mill operation up there, or that the table was a limestone for making soap. The table's about 9 by 6 feet, and it weighs about 4.5 tons. And usually a limestone, I've seen them in a couple of museums. I could pick one up. They're only about 36 to 40 inches across, about 1 inch thick, and have a very shallow groove where the barrel would sit above, put the ashes in there, pour water. take that solution, mix it with animal fat, and you make soap out of it. But our table doesn't really look like that, but that's what mainstream has called it, a big root cellar, I guess, as you were mentioning earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, tell us, I mean, what are some of the weights of some of the largest stones on the site?
Yeah, the rock is granite, and it weighs about 163 pounds per cubic foot. Mm-hmm. And the bedrock is foliated. And this site is actually built on an earthquake fault line, the Clinton-Newberry fault line, which runs out to the Atlantic Ocean, I think out near Cape May, and then it heads down into Connecticut eventually. But so that's kind of interesting. The whole hill is actually split right in half, and you can go up there today and see where the whole thing is cracked right across the entire surface, which is kind of neat. But some of the biggest stones, you can just take the dimensions, the width, the height, the width, and the length of the stone, and then just multiply it out, and you come out pretty close to what the weight of the stone is. And the chamber in ruins, for instance, has a big stone that has fallen into the chamber with a lintel stone. The lintel weighs close to 1,000 pounds. It was just kind of the header over the door that collapsed with a big slab on top of it, which weighs between 6,000 and 7,000 pounds. We estimated. We didn't actually put it on a scale. But so a lot of the roof slabs weigh, 3, 4, 5 tons. There's one next to it, actually. It's even bigger. So that one's probably about between 6,000 and 8,000 pounds. Still a pretty good amount of weight, to move around. And the thought is they might have used some simple machinery, but that's a theory, log rollers, levers, inclined planes of earth, that kind of thing. That's, a theory of how they might have moved them. We weren't there to actually, of course, watch these people do this. So we don't really know their technique.
Well, okay. Well, that was my point, wanting to know, about the weight of some of these stones, because if you were farmers, just you and your family, maybe a neighbor or two, you're not going to go and quarry 5-ton stones to be used for a root cellar or a lye press or what have you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, New England is just full of rocks. And the last thing you really want to do, unless you need a specific rock, a flat rock for a doorstep or, like you say, a limestone, is to go out and quarry stone. It's kind of foolhardy to do that. Rocks are just everywhere. In fact, that's one of the reasons they made walls in New Hampshire, I think starting in the 1700s, is to clear fields of rocks, to build stock fences and boundaries, and sometimes all three purposes for the wall were what I just mentioned, And they're usually linear walls. They're made out of a lot of round field stones. But the stone walls you see at our site all around, and we're starting to clear them out so you can actually see the thousands of feet of walls. They contain very, very large, flat pieces of stone. They've been referred to as fractured stone. And this is manufactured by man. So somebody went to the trouble of actually lifting up bedrock and then building some of these stone walls. My dad had noticed it pretty much back when he started back in the 50s. He goes, the walls surrounding the site, even though they're hidden by all the forest, trees, and brush, if you look at them closely, you see there's a lot of flat slabs in them, that stood up, on their side. We call them orthostats. Mm-hmm. Some of them are horizontal, and some are stood on their end. And the ones that were stood on their end upright turn out to be the alignments with the sun, moon, and stars, which we started working on in 1967. So before that, we knew the stones were out there. Mr. Goodwin back in the 30s was aware of that too, because we had no idea what their function was other than these odd stones standing upright. That takes a lot of work, to quarry it. And again, farmers wouldn't have wasted their time. They're just trying to make a living and clear their fields of rocks. And usually, like I say, they're field stones. And so you can really see the difference between historic walls and what we call prehistoric walls.
Now, does your Stonehenge, do you think that it was constructed by the same group that built the Stonehenge in England?
That question comes up all the time. It's been on.
I bet it does.
TV.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. Functionally, it's the same. I would say what a lot of our researchers feel that the stone structures in Spain and Portugal and even Ireland and some in Scotland look much more like our stones in our site and other New England structures too than Stonehenge itself. But Stonehenge is part of that megalithic, Neolithic going into the Bronze Age. And they have divided into 3 different phases of Stonehenge. So our site was built, we think, about 4,000 years ago. And that would have been like at the third stage of Stonehenge, towards the end building, not the beginning, though. The beginning starts around, I believe, around 5,000 years ago is the best guess at this time with the evidence they have. But not directly probably the same people, but that culture that was spread across Western Europe, the structures, like I say.
Or it could have been maybe somebody passing by the Stonehenge in England said, when we go to America, let's put up something similar to this.
Inspired by it, perhaps. Yeah,
Inspired, yeah.
Inspired by it, yeah. They could have been related. And I think these people traveled a lot further back in time and also further geographically, than
how about that? Isn't that is the damned truth. You talk about science and archaeology trying to hide the facts. I mean, are they trying to hide it? Is it out of ignorance? Or is it for some other reason? I mean, to keep their jobs, or to show that they know more than ancient man did? I mean, why this great concealment?
Boy, that's a $1 million question. We've always wondered why, if they're objective scientists,
on a 64 and on a $64 show. There you go. I mean,
that's a great question, though. I don't know. They've written the history books, and some people have staked their whole careers on a certain belief, the way things were, with our history, and I know history in our schools, is not really being emphasized. Maybe 1492, 1620s, 1776, and you get before 1492, and they don't really discuss it. They go back. If they do, they go to Western Europe and they talk about that. But we have these megalithic sites across the Northeast, and some going all the way out to Colorado, as I mentioned, and maybe Alabama. But we had something like over 200,000 mounds today across North America. Most of them are pyramids, some are geometric, as you know, and some are shaped like effigy mounds, like Serpent Mound out in Ohio. They may have been 1 million mounds at one time. And when I grew up in school, I didn't hear about one of them, and I only knew about our site because we owned it. And I mean, there's even those geoglyphs like the ones in Peru on the Nazca lines, out on the Colorado River, out in Blythe, California, not too far from Las Vegas. There's 130 of them, and they look like the ones in Peru, but nobody knows about them. And I talk to a lot of our visitors, and we talk about this, and I never heard of that. And I said, well, if I didn't work here, I probably wouldn't know about these things either, because I'm interested in it, because we meet so many people that have seen some of these things, but you won't get it out of your school books. I mean, that's kind of sad.
So there's no indication that America's Stonehenge and some of the other sites across New England were built by, say, the Native Americans. Did they work in stone?
That's another big thing too. I grew up, what I always heard was Native Americans, when they used stone, it was for tools, utensils, weapons, that kind of thing. Something you could hold in your hand. And our archaeologist that's been with us since 1989 was the president of New Hampshire Archaeological Society, and she thinks outside the box. She's open-minded. She looks at evidence. She's not, her mind already made up and closed-minded. She actually has to twist some of her colleagues to get them kind of interested in this too. But I said, your colleagues, to them, an artifact is something you hold in your hand, pots and flints. It's not these stone walls, cairns, standing stones, chambers. They don't even look at these things, but these are artifacts, and I think it's part of the ancient past. And your question about Native American, they may have had a hand in this. We just don't know. They may have had, the question is, did they have 100% involvement with our site and other Northeast sites? Was it some, smaller amount, like 50%, or were they not involved in all? We just don't know it. Back in the 60s, most people would say, no, the Native Americans weren't known to do this kind of thing, so it must be old world. But when I look at these chambers, I do see the old world megalithic style to them. So I think there is an old world connection to these structures. I think there's some involvement there, And Native Americans may have been part of it. But so that's changed a little bit. Native Americans were definitely here, maybe 10,000 years in New Hampshire. Goes back to Paleo, just between 10 and 12, I guess, just at the end of the Ice Age. So that's something we don't know. We really don't.
So you gave a possible age of your site as being, what did you say, about 4,000 years old. How were you able to come up with that figure?
Yeah, we've done 12 carbon dating since 1966.
Mm-hmm.
And we were dating, in one case, it was a piece of root. The others were charcoal. And no, we don't date the stone using carbon dating. That's, that. We get that question all, that. But a lot of people go, can you date? They use other methods. I mean, when you're dating stone, you're using other methods, and it goes back hundreds of millions of years or whatever for the age of the stone. But the charcoal, it was the arrangement of the stratigraphic layers. In one case, we got 3 different datings out of an area called the North Chamber. I'm sorry, the Chamber in Ruins, the north wall of that. And it began that particular date was 1967 when we got in there and we found a piece of root growing through a wall. And we had photographs of that stump there in the 1930s, but it was so decayed in the 1930s that they couldn't do tree ring dating. It was just rotted. But they did estimate its age by looking at the diameter and state of decay. And they said, well, it's a white pine and it probably was growing there in the 1600s. So that puts it back before the Paddy family. The important thing is the roots had penetrated through the structure. You don't build a chamber around the tree. The tree grows through the chamber. Mm. And so by 1967, the root itself, the stump was pretty much gone. But they dug into the wall and they were hoping to find a piece of root, and they did. They sent it to Geochrome Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the date came back 1690 AD. So we knew that was before the Paddy family. So everybody, all the mainstream saying all the Paddys built the whole thing. Well, the chamber was there before the Paddy family, and the root had grown through it before that time. In 1969, they went down further, and they went quite a ways. They didn't really find anything for several inches. And all of a sudden, they have layers A at the top, and then B, a different color, strata, and then C is the lower, and it's kind of a lighter soil. And it was undisturbed, so nobody had disturbed it, which is great. And they found charcoal, and they dated it to 3,000 years old. In 71, they went down a little bit further, and they got 4,000-year-old charcoal. And in that mix, they found a hammerstone, rubbing stone, stone scraper, and stone spallings, where somebody had been doing what we call percussion flaking. And that's a technique you use to make like arrowheads, stone knives, stone hoes. It's a kind of a napping thing where you strike the stone and little flakes fall off it, except they were doing that to roof slabs and wall slabs on a very grand scale. And so all those little flakes were left behind when they were dressing or shaping the stone. Below all of that, the bedrock had been removed, and that was discovered in 1971. So they removed all the bedrock. That material was used for the building of the structure, and then they built the wall up, and then the soil very slowly accumulated next to this wall, and that's where they got the 2 charcoal dates, and they got the piece of root date. So,
all right, I'm going to have to interrupt you here because we have to go to our top of the hour break. When we come back, more Exploring the Bizarre, so stay tuned.
Exploring the Bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to the second hour of Exploring the Bizarre. Our guests tonight are Dennis Stone and Jim Willis. And Jim, I wanted to ask you now, we were talking a little bit in the last segment before the break about the possibility that like Native Americans could have been responsible for building America's Stonehenge and some of the other, like stone structures found across, especially the East Coast, but other places as well. And so, I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, is that a possibility?
I look beyond them actually building the site because I'm pretty much convinced in my own mind that this was built by Europeans. Mm-hmm. I think it was built according to, Farley Mowat was, who has written a book called The Farfarers Before the Norse, talks about a people who lived out in the west part of Europe, Western Europe, and Ireland, Scotland, Cornwall, Wales, around in that area. And you find a lot of these kinds of stone structures that look very similar to the same kind of building techniques used at America's Stonehenge. And so it was his idea when my wife Barb and I were writing one of our books, Armageddon Now. We were in touch with Farley Moet before he died. And it was his idea, of course, that centuries before the Norse arrived in North America, as a matter of fact, he would place it about 4,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. These enterprising hunters from the British Isles followed the walrus ivy trade. They were tracking their prey westward to what we now know as the Canadian Arctic and Newfoundland. And each year when the weather closed in, what they would do, they would build stone foundations, which are still there, except they were not seen as house foundations because there's no trees around there. And so they didn't know what they were covered with. Well, what they did was they would build these stone foundations and then roof them over with their boats that were overturned for the winter. The boats became the roof and the walls of these structures. And then with the arrival of spring, they'd return with a full cargo of ivory to sell back to the European markets. Well, I think, these were the same kind of people living at about the same time that America's Stonehenge was thinking. Once you make your way past Ireland and then into Greenland and then Newfoundland and down toward New England, it would only make sense that they would come in and carry that kind of culture with them, that kind of stone culture. But what gets me is the Native Americans at the time didn't build these kind of structures, but they must have been close and friendly with these Western European settlers. I just find it's a fascinating idea that two totally different cultures can exist not only side by side, but actually intermingle and get along with each other in these days when they have all these cultural barriers and everything going up. I just find it's a fantastic thing that these two cultures can live in peace, totally different worldviews, totally different ways of going on, but they seem to, because there's no evidence of that kind of warfare going on between the two. There's no idea of coming over here to conquer. I think they probably were assimilated. And of course, that raises the whole question everybody always brings up. They think it's the giant killer. Well, what about DNA evidence? How come there's no European DNA evidence found in American Indians? But what we don't think about is that very shortly after the first European fishermen started coming over here, way before the Vikings, they brought European diseases with them as well. Mm-hmm. And before, when the Pilgrims and the Puritans, by the time they came, vast amounts of indigenous people had died to these diseases. It had been killed across America. In some cases, fatalities numbering 90%, 95%. Down in Florida, 98% of them died because of these diseases that they had no natural immunity to. And so, of course, that would do a number on your DNA testing. The DNA of the modern indigenous people that we study is DNA that came after the fact, so to speak, when the people started coming back into the area after these tremendous plagues and devastations. So I'm just fascinated when I think about America's Stonehenge, what it must have been like. You put yourself back into that area. Here's a Native American standing up there watching these Europeans doing their things, and what are you doing and why? And I'm wondering, of course, as a professor of comparative religion, how they managed to share and interblend their religious outlook, their spirituality on life. And I wonder what they taught each other. And this went on for thousands of years. So I just find it fascinating. I think it's something that we need to study a lot more about, because it might give us an insight into how differing cultures can get along today rather than fight each other.
When we look at some of these really massive stones that were used at American Stonehenge, it seems to me that this was not just, like you had talked about, when they came, like up in Newfoundland, places like that, build a stone, foundation and then put their boats on top. This was built to last. This was built for people who were going to be there for a while.
Yeah, and I have another theory that I have no idea. I'm just beginning to sort of kind of research it. But when people came over here, of course, it would have been a hard journey across the North Sea, and you're talking about basically walrus hide boats, which were perfectly capable of making the journey. As a matter of fact, in some ways, they were more seaworthy when the when the Romans invaded England, and when they came to Ireland, they found that the old Roman galleys couldn't operate nearly as efficiently as these hide ships that were built by the Western Europeans. So when they came over here, I just can easily visualize them saying, this is a nice place to stay. And when they start their way down the coastline, they start making their way south, and the weather keeps getting better. And they become the first snowbirds to head from New England down here toward Florida. They built these huge shell middens, which are built along the same design and in some of the same areas as the stone structures that we find farther north, circular shell middens. Nobody knows who built them. They know they go back about 4,000 years. They can carbon date them. And they know that they were built when the sea levels were much lower. So we're talking about a people who came here and came down the coastline 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And we say, well, why did they use shells? Well, in New England, you got a lot of rocks. Down here in Florida and South Carolina, we don't have those kind of rocks. You have to use what you have. And they would build these circular shape middens, not just trash heaps, but really structurally interesting middens. And as they come down here, I imagine some of the people would say, this is a nice place. Who wants to go back up north where it's cold? Let's just stay right here. I have no idea that no doubt that the whole eastern seaboard was built up by some of these people, and they must have shared with the cultures who were here, the indigenous people who were here. And I think it was a totally different experience than we had when the Europeans came over after Columbus, and they came over carrying their weapons, and they came over with the idea of destruction. I don't think it was that way at the beginning. I think it was a peaceful migration of people just getting along with each other.
Well, at this point then, so you have America's Stonehenge, and then you have other locations, as Dennis alluded to, up and down the East Coast. So, I mean, this would seem to show that there was probably, I don't want to say an extensive population, but quite a few people coming and going. What happened to them? Why is it that then by the time I know Columbus didn't make it up, into North America, but the other people who finally made it to the East Coast from Europe for the first time found only Native Americans. What happened to these original Europeans?
Some of it was probably climate change. The weather. We had when the Norse were over in Iceland and in Greenland, and what they call the Little Ice Age began, and the population just simply died out, and it just became untenable, the weather, and that probably drove some of them back. Others, I think, there was a great deal of Norse activity about 1,000 years ago, that people were fleeing the Norse. They came over here and they just stopped going back because it was just too dangerous. All of Western Europe and the British Isles, it was really a tough time with the Viking scourge. And I think people came over here and said, why go back there? The market for walrus tusks and ivory, which brought them over here in the first place. The market for fishing, the market's dried up. The trade routes were so disruptive because of the pirating that was going on. And I think after a generation or two, of course, you forget a lot. These were cultures that didn't have a lot of written language, and they just passed the thing down. But you get 2 generations of people born here in America, and they say, I don't want to go back to the old country. They just stayed here. And I think that we entered into a kind of a dark age. And when Columbus sailed over here, of course, he had maps. We know that. He had information. I don't think there's any question that a lot of what he said was not a discovery of America. It was a rediscovery of something that earlier generations had neglected.
Yeah, I've heard that Columbus may have been ignorant that there was a landmass in between Europe and Asia, but that it was like North and South America was probably a what would the term be, and not so best kept secret.
Well, if you'll allow me to put you were nice enough to let me plug my one book that's coming out this fall. I got another one coming out this fall too,
sure,
from a different publisher. This is from Visible Ink, and it continues along the line of my two books that we talked about the last couple of times I've been with you folks. My first with them was Ancient Gods, and my second was Supernatural Gods. And this fall in October, the book is in production now, but it is it's being sold advanced sales already through Amazon and other book dealers. It's called Lost Civilizations: The Secret Histories and Suppressed Technologies of the Ancients. And I talk a lot about these lost civilizations all around the world, and how they built up, how a civilization rose, how it fell, and why, and the different reasons, everything from warfare to the civilization breaking down internally, just because of the power politics and all that kind of thing, and also weather, climate change, and how all this can take a civilization and pretty well destroy it. And it's really fascinating to find out how these things rise and fall. My bottom line after being involved with all this is that we are a much more ancient civilization than we like to think we are. We go way, way back, and much of what we have experienced, we have just simply forgotten and don't want to bring it up. As Dennis said earlier, history books are written. People don't want to rewrite them. And so there is a vast conspiracy of silence out there.
I definitely believe that. Dennis, let me ask you now, after hearing what Jim had to say, have you, the people who have worked at America's Stonehenge, has anybody uncovered anything that may point to who may have been originally the original builders of that site?
Yeah, they have found some evidence, not only at our site, but sites actually from north down through Central and South America. There are inscriptions. I'm sure Jim's pretty aware of hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions have been found. At our site, Dr. Berryfell, quite controversial, among the mainstream. But back in 1975, he first visited our site, and we had already found some stones back in 1964 and put them on display as unknown markings. Actually, they came out of that structure I mentioned called the Chamber in Ruins. And there were 3 different stones that came out of that, kind of triangular. He took them back to Arlington, Massachusetts. He was a professor at Harvard University for 20 years, and he examined them there. And his the result of his study of them, he said, well, one was Iberian Punic, the other one was Celtic Ogham, and the other one was Libyan. And he did get a translation of the Ogham and the Phoenician writing, but the Libyan was kind of, the stone was busted, so he couldn't really get a full translation of it. But he said the one that was Phoenician was Iberian Punic, or Phoenician found in Iberia, Spain, and Portugal. And it said that structure, the Chamber in Ruins, was a temple, sun temple, dedicated to Baal on behalf of the Canaanites, because the Phoenicians were the Canaanites. And the other one was a Celtic Ogham, and it said 1 line plus 2 more lines, which means B and L. Insert the vowel. It was all consonants, no vowels. And he said it was Bel. And that's where we kind of identified that Bel and Baal, or Baal, in the Bible are the same. And the Celts and the Phoenicians worship basically the same sun god. And these markings have been found all the way out to Alberta, Canada, and the Milk River. They've been found all the way down into Brazil and in between. In Georgia, Massachusetts, Vermont has probably the most inscriptions of any of the Northeast sites. They're just everywhere up there, on the standing stones, the monoliths, in the structures, on the roof of the structures. Vermont has the greatest number of inscriptions, I guess. but they're all over New England, and New York has them and everything. So that might be something that might identify the people. But our site would predate what is officially, the Phoenician time period. It would go back about, I think, 500 years before that. Mm-hmm. So that creates a little bit of a problem. Who were these people? I think they were just Western European people coming over here, and eventually, a later time, the Phoenicians were coming in. That might be one of the answers to that problem.
Dennis, Dennis, could you talk about that sight line, the Equinox sight line that when you carried it through? I think your son did the work, carried it through and bisected the trilithon at Stonehenge, and went on to Lebanon, a place where the Phoenicians were.
Sure, yeah. Well, he did that. He was in college at the time in 2012, and he was just taking lines out from our site, looking to see if other New England sites were aligned with it. And they had done some of this work in the 1970s, but with Google Earth, it's much, much easier. I mean, it's just amazing what you can do with it. But he took the line across as actually the summer solstice sunrise alignment, and he starts at the astronomical center. It goes over that stone that's asymmetrically shaped, and the stone is actually shaped to fit two hills that are about 5 miles distance. They have kind of a notch. It's called the horizon feature, and these are found in some of the European sites, like up in Scotland. There's a site called Belacroix. It has the same kind of thing. Kentra in Scotland. But these make beautiful alignments, and you're looking miles. So you have a foresight, a back sight, and you have the hill or the notch, and then you have the object, such as a sun, moon, or perhaps a star. And it makes for a very, very long alignment, much more accurate. Well, he just took that alignment and kept traveling on that till he went right across New England, went across Nova Scotia, past Newfoundland, and he ended up on the other side over turns out in England. And he said, gee, that looks like it goes, in southern England. That looks interesting. So he changed the scale. And as he kept changing it, noticing it was pretty close to where he knew Stonehenge was. And as he kept expanding the scale, all of a sudden there's Stonehenge. And the line goes right through the large trilithon. It was like, wow, that's pretty amazing, It was kind of, when he told me about it, I got the hair stood up on my neck. I'm like, wow, that's, even if it's a coincidence, that is pretty amazing, to have it go right through the center of that. So the line eventually was carried over, and it does go into the Phoenician coast, and it goes close to Beirut. I think it goes right near Byblos, but then it continues into the Golan Heights, and there's the Israeli Stonehenge, the Giant's Wheel, they call it. That's pretty amazing, and it goes right through that also. But it does go through the Phoenician coast, and it was just one of those really, really neat things. We have looked at other alignments there. The true south alignment goes through an effigy mound in Andover, Massachusetts, a great big turtle mound shaped like, it's made out of stone. It's probably about 50 or 60 feet across. It's like a very, very large cairn, if you will, but it's shaped like a turtle. That alignment goes through that. But if you continue, and you end up in South America, it goes right by Machu Picchu, which is cool. And if the winter solstice sunset, and these should be tried by other people. We've done it over and over and over again to our best ability. And that winter solstice sunset actually goes through the moon pyramid at Teotihuacan. And I took the equinox sunset, and it goes through Chaco Canyon, and then the equinox sunrise rises over the Canary Island pyramids. So there's a lot of kind of neat things that were like, wow, And without Google Earth, I don't know if we could have had the time to do all of that. So there are some things that are wrong with the site.
Have you had any dowsers out there to see if there's any kind of energy associated with these lines rather than just geographical?
Sure. Yeah, we had a dowsing group. I think it was in 2017. There's a lady. She's out of Westford, Mass, with the Westford Knight, which is another interesting thing. Sir Henry Sinclair. I think you mentioned him earlier.
Yes. Yeah.
That's where this knight is carved. Anyway, she's from that area, and she's from Leominster, Mass. originally. But she has a dowsing group. But back in the 70s, we had Sig Longren. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Sig.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much.
Oh, you are? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think he's been in England for, a couple decades now. But he came to our site many times in the 70s, and I guess he was a president of the America's Dowsing Association.
Yes,
I think at the time.
Yeah.
We have had these people, and Francis Hitching, John Mitchell, and in 78 they did a map, and they show the water lines where some of our stone walls overlay the water lines that they doused.
Mm-hmm.
And the alignment, one of the big alignments is a summer solstice that goes right over to Stonehenge, the one we just mentioned. That's one of the ones that they were looking at in 78, and they had it highlighted on the map, which I only found this whole, it's like a small book they put together in 78, and I found it like 2 years ago in my dad's archives. I'm like, wow, look at that. That's just what my son had found, in 2012. So, yeah, we've had dowsers there. My dad found the first well for our visitor center back in 1958 by dowsing for it. So, and he didn't know if dowsing worked or not, but he tried it and it worked, so it was kind of. Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I was asked to go over to Cornwall and speak to the Parallel Community had put together a group on, and they wanted me to talk about the basis of a lot of world religions. And of course, while I was there, I had to go to Stonehenge. And it was right after I had learned about that sight line that you were just talking about. And so I was able to stand right there at Stonehenge and look right down where that sight line would go and realize I was looking right at you at the time. It was quite an amazing thing. Yeah.
That is pretty cool. Wow. I'm sure we're going to discover more of these things, but that is pretty amazing. Yeah. How about that?
Yeah.
Jeez.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to interrupt you here because we are coming up to our bottom of the hour break. And when we come back, we have a question from one of our listeners for Dennis. So we'll make everybody wait till after our break's over with. So stay tuned. Tonight we're talking with Dennis Stone and Jim Willis on Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to the final segment of Exploring the Bizarre. Our guests tonight are Dennis Stone and Jim Willis. Gentlemen, we have a question from Brian, and Brian wants to know, he says that Stonehenge in England had stones that had been moved miles to that site, referring to the blue stones. Now, in America's Stonehenge, he said that New England has a lot of granite. So are the stones in America's Stonehenge carved locally, or were they moved from someplace else?
I think they were lucky because they didn't have to move them like miles. I think the Sarsens at Stonehenge came from about 20-something miles away at Marlborough Downs, and others came from Ireland. I think the Bluestones came from Ireland. But they quarried the top of the hill, and at the time the hilltop was pretty bare, mostly just bare bedrock. So they would send out crews looking for ideal places to actually lift up the bedrock. It is foliated. This bedrock does come up like an onion layer, and it does come up. And they would raise a stone, they would prop it with another stone, and then they would start hammering it to shape it, and then they would drag it. The biggest stones, probably one of the biggest roof slabs that was never moved, it was just raised, probably would weigh something like about 5 tons. And it's still about 1,000 feet from the main site. It's been raised up, propped, and you can see where it has a serrated edge where they were striking it with their percussion flaking. And they never moved it. And we found about 33 of these stones all over the hilltop, most of them just in the last 2 years. The first one in 1982. But when I retired, we started finding more of them. And I think the site was going to be a much bigger construction, and they were still working on it because all these stones are all over the landscape, and we keep discovering more of these big prop stones. And they just abandoned the project, which it kind of struck me about 2 years ago. I said, I think they had a much grander plan, and they walked away for this. And then it raised a question: Why would they do that? Why would they abandon it? So the stones are pretty local. Yeah, they didn't have to go 20 or 200 miles away to get them.
Can you imagine how much more we would know if America's Stonehenge hadn't been plundered so much for the last 200 years by people who were taking out stones to build buildings and stones to build roads and just kind of raping the place, so to speak. Can you imagine how much we would learn if that site was pristine? Wow.
Well, Dennis, you make an interesting point, though, that something happened, that they abandoned the building, and a group like that usually doesn't just put their tools down and walk away for no reason. So something probably bad had to have happened.
It seems like it came to an end, yeah, because originally we thought maybe the site was completed, perhaps, and then eventually abandoned after, like so many sites around the world, they're eventually abandoned, for whatever reason. But it looks like they had like I say, they were still in the middle of a building project, and then it came to a stop. So that's kind of interesting question. What happened to these people?
I suppose we could probably. Postulate that the site was a long time in the making. It wasn't just one generation, but perhaps many generations of people were building it, adding on. And then we just can't discount that whole idea of the European diseases. The Norse would have been coming by. All it would take would be somebody to pick up a bug in Iceland and travel to Greenland and come down to Maine and into New Hampshire and spread it around, and smallpox, measles, who knows what, and with no natural immunities. I mean, that could really do a number on your population. And then without the population needed to rebuild the stone, I imagine it could come to an end pretty quick. It would be terribly demoralizing spiritually too if this was a ceremonial center and all of a sudden you were to have some kind of an outbreak of some kind of disease. That people must have said, why are the gods doing this to us? Of course, it's all just speculation, but it certainly raises some possibilities.
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, a disease can decimate a population quickly.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the what was it, the Spanish flu. Look how whole communities, were just taken out.
Yeah.
So
in Florida, within one generation, 10, 20, 30 years, losing 90% of the population. Can you imagine standing there with 10 of your friends and 9 of them are gone, just like that? And the terrible thing is, in a situation like that, it's the young people and the old people who die first. Mm-hmm. And it's the young people who have the energy, but it's the old people who have the wisdom. And the wisdom, the knowledge would be gone. And it wouldn't take long for people to forget how to do this. It must have been just devastating to see that. We know it happened in Florida. We know it happened in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire. When the Pilgrims and the Puritans came, we know that by then the devastations had already wreaked havoc on the people there. The Algonquian people, it must have been just a terrible thing. Now, we don't know for sure that was the reason that they stopped building. It might have been warfare. It might have been invasion by another people. Who knows? It might have been the weather. It's hard to tell. It might have been a change in religion. People don't take projects like this without having a very important reason, and usually that reason that will motivate people and cause people to dedicate their lives to this kind of building project is usually some kind of religious reason. They believe they're doing it for a spiritual purpose. And if that spiritual purpose is gone, then that's the project is over. Julius Caesar used this on purpose against the Druids, for instance, when he was taking on the conquest of Gaul. He knew he had to just rip the heart out of the people, and so what he would do would go into the sacred groves, the oak groves where the Druids gathered, and he would just burn them and cut them down. And the people just saw their very religion, they found spiritual foundation upon which they stand. When it was gone, they just melted back into the hills. They said, we can't fight people like this who take over, and their gods must be stronger than our gods. And as a result, that was the end of the Druids. It was all Julius Caesar and his ilk.
Very demoralizing.
Yeah.
Okay, Dennis. I mean, keeping along those lines, has anybody ever discovered any kind of burials there in your location?
Well, we do know the soil in the New England area is quite acidic. It doesn't really preserve bones too well. And I talked to our archaeologist, the lady I mentioned, and she said usually a couple hundred years. You can find some bones up to a couple thousand years, but generally speaking, most of them dissolve back into the ground. because of the acidity of the soil and the weathering conditions. But the chambers, like the one chamber is called the East-West Chamber, looks like some of the gallery graves are found in Holland. They're called the Giant's Bed. They're in Northwest Ireland. And I've been to Ireland, but I didn't get the chance to see those. But they're in France. And when I was in France, I saw a few of them. They always face true east and west, just like our chamber. They run 20 to 60 feet in length, just like ours. And some of them have these orthostats, which are the stones stood on their end with stone roofs, of course, and they were used as burial chambers. The V hut we have, it looks like the letter V, looks like a couple of the wedge tombs I saw in Ireland. They also exist in Spain. The ones in Ireland always face southwest, from what I've told, and the ones I did visit. There may be some exceptions to that, but the size, the shape, and the orientation of our V hut looked like the wedge tombs my dad and I had visited back in 1983. I said, my God, it looked just like our chamber. And they were used as tombs. And they were kind of empty. The ones in Ireland, some were being used by farmers to put hay in, or they were being used for storage and stuff like that. Some were just with the roofs missing. But we saw several of them. And I said, gosh, but it looks just like our chamber, the same shape, size, and orientation. And so some of these chambers could have been burial, but when Mr. Goodwin got there 80 years ago, they dug, they cleaned, they sifted, but they didn't use they didn't send soil in to have it chemically analyzed to see if there were some trace elements that might indicate it was a burial. They just didn't have that technology. It wasn't really his fault. He was working with the tools he had at the time 80 years ago, but today it would be done much more carefully, of course, and we could get so much more information from just the soil itself, and that might have revealed that, in fact, it was a burial chamber, both of those structures, So, no, we haven't found, we have found some bones in the site. We have found what it was looked at in 1970 as being a human bone. I don't know what became of that. It went to a museum to have further work on it. It was before DNA and everything. They said it was human, so it could have been something recent. It could have been something old. And then we found some bones, including what looked like a bison bone found in what we call the watch house. It was but they didn't carbon date it. It was found in 1958. It could have been carbon dated because that came out in 1950, but we didn't do that. So a couple of chambers could have been burial tombs, possibly.
Dennis, has there been any evidence of the red paint people? I guess now that's called now they're called the Maritime Archaic Civilization, coming down inland that far into New Hampshire?
Well, in Massachusetts, James Woodall, one of the researchers that worked on our site in the 60s, he died in 1998, and he was working on a site, I believe it was in Massachusetts. I'm trying to think what town it was in, and they did find red ochre. And not at our site that I recall, but it has been found in New England.
Yeah.
So
It's awfully close. I know there's a red paint people or a maritime archaic civilization site on North Haven Island up in Penobscot Bay, which is not that far away from where you are.
Right. Yeah, and there was one in Massachusetts. I wish I could remember. It may have been Amesbury, Mass. It's in one of the books by David Brody. He mentions the whole thing. Where the site was. It's one of his more recent books. He actually identifies the area, and I believe it was in Massachusetts, and he gives the town. But James Woodall worked on that I think in the early 70s or perhaps the late 60s. So that has been even close to us. The red paint. That's
and now that culture would have started 5,000 years ago, but it was still flourishing 4,000 years ago when your site was built.
Right across the North Atlantic, yeah.
Now, I understand that not only the carbon dating, but also when you compute the sight lines, that the sight lines were in line about 3,800 years ago, about the same time as the carbon thing. So if it is a archaeoastronomy, if those are figured in, then that's another dating that brings you right back to that 4,000 year period, right?
That's a great point. Yeah, in 71 we get the 4,000 year, and that's the oldest one in the main site. We do have one other date out near the Northstone alignment, and that was about 7,400 years old. It appears to be a fire pit. It didn't date the site, but it looks like somebody was there, Middle Archaic time period, building a fire. I'll throw that in there. But back to the main site, the 4,000-year-old date, in 1977, we had already done 4 years of survey work on the astronomical alignments. That data was sent to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Mass. In 1978, we get the results back, and they said if these stones monoliths were used for astronomical purposes, it would work about 1800 BC, as you mentioned, about 3,800 years ago, plus or minus a couple hundred years, due to the Earth's tilt. The obliquity, and it goes through that 41,000-year cycle. And it's interesting that Sir Norman Lockyer, 100 years ago, who worked on Stonehenge and other sites, said, these sites seem to be off a little. There's an error in the solstices. The equinox still works, but the lunar alignments and the cross-quarter days seem to be off. If we can identify the time that they work, we can tell you how old this site is. And he was already onto that 100 years ago. So that's the data we use, you know. So we used astronomical and radiocarbon dating. And then the way the stones were shaped using stone tools at percussion flaking would put it back into the Stone Age period too. It doesn't really date it specifically, but it shows you it's probably not a colonial or post-colonial, construction, you know.
So you have different fields of evidence all merging at that 4,000-year-old date then, huh?
It does seem to be that, yes, absolutely. And one of the stars, Izar, there's a 14-foot monolith that was found 20 years ago. And Dr. Winkler from Penn State, he was an archaeoastronomer for 30 years, began working towards the end of his career at Penn State. And he worked on our site for about 3 or 4 years and even published a little bit. And then he suddenly died, unfortunately, in 2001. He said Izar would have aligned with his 14-foot menhir, or it's a long stone, if you will, like a tall monolith. And that would be about about 4,000 years ago. It would have been about 1 century that it would work. It was a polar grazing, what do they call it? Polar circumpolar grazing star alignment.
Wow.
And that data was sent over to England about 3 years ago. A gentleman named Alan Butler. He's been on a number of TV shows. He does a lot of research. He sent it to his friend who's an astronomer, and he gave him the information. He goes, that's right, about 100 years period, because of the precession of, precession of the Earth, the precession of the equinoxes, the Earth, how the 26,000-year cycle, it would eventually throw it out. But for about a 100-year period, about 4,000 years ago, it would work. It would actually align with that. So it's maybe the third way, to tell, but it's astronomical.
So here we have these sophisticated people who had a knowledge of the night skies far superior to anybody that I know, or probably anybody that any of us know. And they did it simply with their eye. They had, even modern astronomers would have to be using computers. They'd have to be using telescopes. And these people did it just by observing the night sky. I think that's absolutely unbelievable. These were intelligent people.
Absolutely.
And that was one of the questions that I was going to ask. You were talking about the alignments with America's Stonehenge and in places like England Stonehenge and beyond that. How could these people do that without the knowledge of like longitude, latitude, things like that?
Yeah.
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 That's the mystery. Yeah.
Well, we have other things too, like the serpent wells, and might be as above, so below. Draco, the constellation of Draco, the dragon, and 4,000 years ago, one of its stars, Alpha Draconis, Thuban, was the pole star, So at the time of around 4,000 years ago, at the course of the night, Thuban would have been spinning around this dragon around one of its stars, and that would have been true north, and some people felt that was the gateway to heaven. And they may have brought that down and built stone walls, and maybe the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio and others, were built. Maybe.
When we moved here to South Carolina, we found a number of stone piles around in the woods. We kind of absolutely stumbled over this idea that some archaeologists are now calling the problem of stone piles. They were built for many different reasons. Some of them were built to clear fields, but a lot of them, some of them right here on our property, for instance, where we live, were not that way at all. And so I got a surveyor friend of mine and I spent a day going around and looking and marking where all these stone piles were. And we came back and put it on a chart, and they looked awfully familiar. So when I brought up a star chart, on the ground, we had a perfect overlay of the stars from the Northern Cross from the constellation of Cygnus.
Oh,
And
wow.
when I discovered this, as above, so below, so to speak, I realized that there's a place right up there where I call it my shaman circle now. I go up there a lot. And you can actually stand there and look on these hilltops. And on the night of the winter solstice, if they had fires at each of these places, the fires would be burning, and you would see on the ground an exact representation of what was taking place in the heavens at the Northern Cross, the Christmas cross.
Ooh.
As soon as I discovered this and tied it in with Cygnus, I got in touch with Andrew Collins right away, who's probably the biggest Cygnus authority, and he wrote back within an hour, and he said, "Are there any bird cults in your area?" Well, of course, right over the river we have the hawk effigy and the eagle effigy. So obviously this was going on. So this whole idea of the ancients bringing the heavens down to earth, as above, so below. It's there's an awful lot to that. I'm just fascinated by the whole science of it.
I would think I saw some cruciform shapes in some of the chambers over in Europe with my dad in Ireland, also in Mexico. And I'm thinking, maybe it's Cygnus because it is shaped like a cross. That could have inspired some of those, possibly, again.
Yeah, I don't think the cross. I mean, we just associate the cross with Christianity, but I think the cross is a much more ancient symbol than that. And of course, we see it in the sky right up here, the Great Northern Cross, which comes out at Christmas time. And when you look at it and you see it there, you realize it's a perfect image of above and below and side to side, and these lines meet right at the heart chakra, so to speak, the center of it all. And of course, Cygnus is the swan. Although some people call him some people call it a different kind of birds, from eagles and hawks, even to storks. But Cygnus bisects the Milky Way, and it is the place where the ancients, especially at Göbekli Tepe, who knew this so much better than we do, they believed that it was in this location that the souls would depart and make their journey to the skies. It's a fascinating thing. I really recommend anybody who's interested in this. I really recommend Andrew Collins' book, The Cygnus Mystery, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Gentlemen, we're unfortunately rapidly running out of time, and Troy wanted to know, have there been any UFO or Bigfoot sightings in the area of America's Stonehenge?
I think in Derry there was a report of a very, very tall, hairy kind of thing. It's in one of the local books on folklore. I think it happened quite a few years ago. And then we had the incident at Exeter back in 1965, and we also had the Bonnie and Betty Hill, but that was further north. And actually, Betty became a friend of my mom's. And last year we had Travis up, so we're kind of into the UFO thing too. I find it a fascinating subject, but none have landed on our property that I'm aware of. But down at Incident Exeter was a big one, and there was one the next town over where it was reported. It's one of those case studies too, but at our hill, not yet that I'm aware of.
And you're not that far north of the big the triangle down in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. What do they call it? The Devil's Triangle down here on the inside.
Bridgewater?
Southeast of southeast of Boston, or
Bridgewater,
southwest.
I think. Bridgewater Triangle.
Bridgewater, right? The Bridgewater.
I've heard of
Triangle.
that. Yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah, we're pretty close to that. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. I've spent some time down there. Really interesting energies down there.
Okay, guys, before we have to wrap up here, I want to let our audience know a little bit more about where they can find out more about you. So, Dennis, you have a website or anything like that?
Yeah, we have Instagram, Facebook, and then we have StonehengeUSA.com, and it has an email address and a phone number, so they can reach us that way.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody's in the area, where can they find you?
Yeah, we're you mean the location is
yes.
We're in North Salem, North Salem, New Hampshire, and under America Stonehenge, if you go to your Google Play Store, they have an app, and you can actually do a virtual tour on us. It's something new we started last summer, so they can actually do it from their home if they like.
All right, cool. And Jim, what about you?
www.jimwillis.net is the website that has all kinds of things that lists all the books I've written and the articles I've written and some dowsing videos and things like that. And on Facebook, it's jimwillis.author.
All right. And go ahead.
And the two new books coming out this fall, The Quantum Akashic Field and Lost Civilizations, coming out this fall.
All right, fantastic. And just real quick, the supernatural gods, and what was the other one?
Ancient Gods, Lost Histories, Hidden Truths, and the Conspiracy of Silence, and Supernatural Gods, Spiritual Mysteries, Psychic Experiences, and Scientific Truths.
Well, and I have to tell everyone that both of those books are just absolutely fantastic, and I highly recommend them. And I can't wait to read your new ones when they come out, and we'll have to have you back on.
I'd love to come. To
talk about those.
And Dennis, I hope I can get up to America's Stonehenge soon. I'd love to meet you and bring my dowsing rods.
I'll help you both come up there. I would love to meet both of you. So anytime, come on up. I'll give you a tour.
Oh, you can't beat that.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic show. I've learned a lot, and I think our audience has learned a lot as well. And so, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up. So I want to thank everyone for listening. Thanks to Tim Beckley and all of our friends. And be sure to go out and buy my newest book, Jeff the Talking Mongoose, the Eighth Wonder of the World. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you again next week. Good night.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100, exploring the bizarre.